Someone once decided you were not worth the trouble. Maybe they said it out loud. Maybe they just walked away and let their leaving say it for them. You know what that kind of judgment feels like from the inside? And you know something else too? That the people doing the deciding are not always the ones who end up right. Here's where it begins. The flatbed backed into the gravel lot without warning on a gray morning in April of 1991. Ramps dropped. Chains rattled loose. A tractor rolled off under its own idle. Tires low, hood cracked down the middle, and the driver was gone before the dust settled. Clara Wynn Holt walked out from the farmhouse with a dish towel still in her hand. She stood at the edge of the lot and looked at the machine, now parked in the middle of her life without permission. The engine ticked as it cooled. Somewhere behind her, the screen door banged shut in the wind, and she did not turn around to close it. Up close, the tractor looked worse than it had from a porch. Dust filmed the cab glass thick enough to write in. One rear tire sat flat against the gravel. A crack ran the length of the hood, patched once with a bead of silicone that had long since given up holding. Rust had already found the exposed edge of the fender where the paint had chipped away. It was not a machine anyone had loved in a long while, and it showed the way neglect always shows on iron. Not loudly, but everywhere at once. She had run the repair barn alone for 9 years by then, since Earl had gone in his sleep on a Tuesday in February and left her the barn, the tools, and 40 acres of Oak Ridge County ground that did not care whether she was ready. She had not been a mechanic before that February. She had been a farmer's wife who paid attention. The difference, she had learned, was smaller than people assumed and larger than she had expected. In the early months after Earl died, she had not planned on any of it. She had taught agriculture at the county school for 14 years before that, the kind of teaching that explained how a hydraulic system worked without ever requiring her to rebuild one. The barn had simply been there, full of Earl's tools, and the neighbors who had trusted Earl for 30 years had started bringing their broken equipment to his widow because the dealership in Millhaven was a 40-minute drive and always backed up 2 weeks deep. She had fixed the first few jobs slowly, a service manual open on the workbench and Earl's old mechanic friend from the next county on the phone whenever she got stuck. The work had been good. The farmers had come back. By the 3rd year, she had a name for honest work on machines other shops did not want, and by the 6th, she had specialized, without ever deciding to, in Massey Ferguson iron, because that was what the smaller farms around Oak Hollow could afford and what the Millhaven dealership had the least patience for. A single sheet of paper sat folded on the tractor seat. She climbed up, unfolded it, and read a transfer of title already signed over to her name. Beneath the signature line, in handwriting she recognized from a dozen invoices, was a note. "Clara, this one's past saving. Yours if you want it. Sorry for the trouble. Wade." She read it twice. Then she climbed down, walked back to the house, and called Wade Pruitt at the dealership in Millhaven. He picked up on the 3rd ring, already talking before she finished saying hello. He told her the Massey Ferguson had come in on trade 2 weeks earlier from a man upgrading to something newer. The paperwork said 9,000 hours. The gauge, once a shop mechanic got a real look at it, said closer to 11. By the time the injection pump trouble and the cracked hood and the leaking hydraulics turned up, the trade was already signed and the farmer was 3 counties gone in his new machine. Clara asked him if he had considered asking her before he backed a flatbed into her yard. Wade admitted he had not. He said he figured she would say yes if he asked in person and no if she had time to think it over on the phone. So he had skipped both and let the tractor do the asking. She was quiet long enough that he asked if she was still there. She was. She wanted to know what exactly was wrong with it. He read the list like a man reading a grocery order he was embarrassed to be buying. Injection pump failing. Hydraulic pump leaking at the rear seal. Front axle bearings worn past spec. Cab seal shot. No pressurization. One hydraulic cylinder with a bent rod, likely from an impact nobody had bothered to explain. Clara asked what it would have brought fixed up. Wade said 18, maybe 19,000. In good shape. Parts and labor at shop rates to get there would run 12 to 14. The math did not clear a profit worth the floor space. Clara did her own math standing at the kitchen counter with the phone cord stretched taut. Her labor cost nothing but her evenings. Her parts came from a supplier in Danbury who gave her farmer pricing because she had never once been late on an invoice. Her hood crack, her seals, her bearings, she had fixed worse out of that barn for less. She told Wade she would keep it. He said he was grateful, in the flat voice of a man relieved more than grateful. She hung up before he could apologize a second time. She stood in the lot afterward with the dish towel, still balled in one fist, looking at a machine that a man with a business degree and a showroom had decided was worth nothing, and she began, in the slow, methodical way she approached everything mechanical, to disagree with him. The injection pump came out first that Monday before the sun was fully up. She had rebuilt 3 before this one, and her hands knew the sequence better than her memory did. The order of the bolts, the angle of the wrench in the tight space behind the block, the particular give of a seal that was about to let go versus one that would hold another season. A kit from Danbury cost her $280. 2 evenings of work after chores. Under a single drop, light hung from a nail Earl had driven into the rafter years before, and the pump went back and clean. The hydraulic seal took an afternoon. She kept that part in stock because it failed often enough on machines of that era to make hoarding it practical. $40 for hours done before supper. The front axle bearings fought her for 3 days. One race had spun loose in its housing, and the fix needed machine work she could not do in a barn. A trip to a shop in Millhaven, $85 for the bearings, $160 for the machining, and a full day lost waiting on someone else's schedule, which she hated more than any of the actual labor. The cab seal had rotted to dust. She cut a new one from foam stock she kept for exactly this kind of improvising, glued it in with contact cement, and pressurized the cab to test it. It held on the first try, which she noted the way she noted everything, accurately, without letting herself feel too good about it yet. The bent cylinder rod was the one that worried her. Straightening a rod without weakening the metal underneath took equipment she did not own. She had a strip machine along her back fence, a smaller Massey she had picked up 2 years earlier for parts, and its cylinder fit with a bracket modified to match. That one cost her nothing but time and a Saturday morning spent under the loader arm with a flashlight in her teeth. Total spent to bring the machine back from what Wade Pruitt had called past saving, $571. 11 working evenings, stretched across 3 weeks around a full repair schedule she still had to keep. Some nights, she worked past dark with nothing but the drop light and the sound of her own breathing. And some nights she stopped early because her hands had gone stiff and the cold and stubbornness alone was not going to get a seal to seat correctly. She kept a running tally in a spiral notebook she had started the week Earl died and never stopped filling, parts, hours, what worked, what she would do differently next time. She did not think of it as a record of anything important. It was simply how she kept from losing track. She started the engine on a Tuesday morning in May. It ran rough for the first 30 seconds, the way any engine does after a long silence, coughing twice before it caught the rhythm it had apparently never fully forgotten. Then it smoothed out and idled steady, low, and even, the sound of something remembering what it was built to do. She engaged the hydraulics. They answered without hesitation, the loader arm rising clean on the first pull, no shudder, no delay. She drove it once around the lot and parked it back where the flatbed had left it, and she sat in the cab a moment longer than the job required, listening to an engine that 3 weeks earlier had been declared, by a man who ought to have known better, past the point of being worth the trouble. Then she climbed down and called Wade again. She told him it was running. He said that was something. She said it was. She did not tell him what she had spent or what she was already turning over in her mind on the drive back to the house. She only said thank you for the paperwork and hung up. What she was turning over was not a plan yet. It was an observation that had been building in her for 9 years and had finally come into focus over those 3 weeks in the barn. The equipment that came through her door was not failing because it was bad equipment. It was failing because nobody had the time, the money, or the knowledge to maintain it the way it was meant to be maintained. And the gap between what the dealership charged and what a family farm could pay was exactly the width of that failure. She had been filling that gap one broken machine at a time for 9 years. Farmers brought her what was already ruined, and she fixed it, and they went home grateful and broke and no better prepared for the next breakdown than they had been for the last one. What crystallized standing in front of that running Massey Ferguson was a different question. What if the gap could be filled before the machine broke, instead of after? She spent 2 weeks that summer talking to the farmers who already trusted her, not telling them what she was thinking, only asking what they had put off. She asked it at the counter while they waited on an invoice, and out in the field while she waited on a part, and once over coffee at the diner in Oak Hollow with a man who had brought his combine in 3 times that spring for the same fixable problem. What she heard confirmed what she already suspected. Oil changes pushed back a season. Filters run twice as long as they should. Grease fittings dry because greasing meant an hour nobody had. Pre-planting inspection skipped because the cost of the inspection competed directly with the cost of the seed, and the seed always won that argument in April. One farmer told her, without much shame in it, that he had not opened his service manual in 6 years because the manual assumed a kind of time he had stopped having the year his father got sick, and the whole operation fell to him alone. Another said he knew exactly what his hydraulic pump needed and had known it for a season, and had simply decided to wait until it failed because waiting cost nothing up front, even though everyone in the county understood, without saying it aloud, that waiting always cost something eventually. Clara wrote it all down that night in the spiral notebook, not as complaints, but as a pattern she was only now letting herself see clearly. She wrote the terms of a service agreement in her kitchen that July, at the same table where she still kept Earl's coffee mug in the cabinet, because she had never gotten around to putting it anywhere else. A flat yearly fee, scheduled oil changes, filter changes, fluid service, greasing, and 1 full inspection before planting season, covering up to 3 machines. $480 a year per machine. She ran the numbers twice to be sure the fee covered her time and still beat what she made fixing things after they had already failed. And it did, because prevention is faster work than repair, and faster work done on a schedule is worth more than the same work done in a panic. She mailed the agreement to 22 farmers that September, typed on Earl's old machine at the kitchen table, each envelope addressed by hand, because she did not trust a form letter to carry the weight of what she was asking them to believe. 14 signed within a month. A few of the others called first, wanting to know why a woman who fixed things after they broke was suddenly asking to be paid before anything broke at all. She told them the truth, which was that she was tired of watching good machines get ruined by neglect nobody could afford to call neglect out loud. Most of them signed anyway. Eventually, once the first planting season came and went without a single breakdown among the farms that already had. There is a particular kind of attention that gets called sentimental until the day it turns out to be the only accurate accounting in the room. A dealer looks at a machine and sees hours on a gauge and a price on a lot. A woman who has spent 9 years listening to engines find their idles sees something else. Not what the machine costs, but what it is still worth to someone willing to notice. Nobody trains you for that kind of noticing. You either had someone in your life who did it, or you learn it the slow way alone in a barn with a coffee mug you cannot bring yourself to move. What is it, really, that separates a thing thrown away from a thing simply not yet understood? By January, the barn had 19 signed agreements covering 41 machines, and the Massey Ferguson that Wade Pruitt had called past saving stood at the center of every walkthrough Clara gave a new customer. The machine she pointed to when she wanted a farmer to see, with his own eyes, what clean oil and a fresh seal actually looked like from the inside. The business grew the way honest work grows in a small county, which is to say slowly, and then all at once, carried by one farmer telling the next one that it had actually worked. By the close of 1993, she had 47 agreements across 4 counties and had hired her first help, a retired mechanic named Otto Reinecke, who had put in 22 years at a dealership before they told him, more than once, that doing the job right cost more than the company wanted to spend. He worked 3 days a week, understood her way of doing things without needing it explained, and never once asked her to cut a corner she had already decided not to cut. She bought a used service truck at a county auction that same year, a 3/4 ton with a service body, $6,000, nothing new about it, nothing that needed financing. She stocked it herself and worked out a route across 4 counties that wasted the least gas and covered the most machines, and she drove that route in the early morning before the day's repair calls came in. The Massey Ferguson stayed along the back fence, used for her own 40 acres, lent out now and then when a customer's own tractor was down for something bigger than a service call. By the time it crossed 13,000 hours, she had rebuilt the clutch herself on a Sunday because the barn was quiet. And she liked the work best when nobody was watching her do it. She kept it exactly the way she kept every machine that mattered to her. Clean, greased on schedule, oil changed before the calendar told her it was due rather than after. New customers noticed it the first time they walked the property, parked apart from the others, no rust creeping in at the fenders, no crack anywhere in the hood that had once split down the middle. When they asked about it, she told them the truth in as few words as the truth required. A dealer once decided it was not worth the trouble of fixing. She had made a different decision, and here it was, still running. In the spring of 1994, a farmer named Roy Bramwell drove in from 2 counties over, his truck bed loaded with a hydraulic ram he had already given up on fixing himself. A neighbor of his had been on one of Clara's agreements since the beginning and had not had a single planting season interrupted since. Roy asked if she was still taking new customers. He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed on a drive over, half expecting to be turned down. She told him she had room for a few more, and watched something in his shoulders let go that she recognized from every farmer who walked into that barn already braced for bad news. He signed for 3 tractors and a combine before he left that day, and told 2 more farmers about her before the year was out, and both of them called within the same week, which was how she knew the word had started moving on its own, faster than she could have pushed it herself. By the end of 1995, the agreements covered 63 farms and 180 machines, and her revenue from those agreements alone had crossed $200,000. Otto had gone full-time. She had hired a second mechanic, a young woman named Bonnie Kessler who had grown up wrenching on her family's own worn-out equipment and had never had a lesson she did not teach herself first. Bonnie could diagnose a failing bearing by the sound alone, standing 10 feet from the machine with her eyes half closed, and Clara recognized in her the same instinct she had spent 9 years teaching herself the hard way. Not book knowledge, but the kind that came from listening to enough engines to know the difference between a sound that meant nothing and a sound that meant everything. The 2 of them worked the barn together most mornings before splitting off across the county in separate trucks, and by the second season, Clara had stopped checking Bonnie's work behind her, which was its own kind of milestone, quiet and unannounced, the way most of the real ones were. The barn Earl had left her had been added on it twice. The gravel lot that the flatbed had once backed in and now held a service truck, a shelf of stock parts, and whatever machine was mid-repair that week. The Massey Ferguson sat where it had always sat, clean, running, unbothered by any of it. The hard years came at the end of the decade, the way they always did somewhere in Oak Ridge County, and they moved Clara's business in the opposite direction from most of her neighbors. When money got tight, the farms that were not on an agreement deferred what they could not afford, and the machines that came into her barn arrived worse than they used to. Injection systems run bone dry, seals that had been failing quietly for a season before they gave out for good, bearings that had been past spec since summer and only announced it during the worst week of planting. Her agreement customers did not have that problem. Their machines got serviced whether the harvest check had cleared or not, because the fee was already paid and the schedule did not ask anyone's permission. Word of that difference traveled faster through the county than any advertisement could have. Farms that had come to her with a catastrophic failure signed an agreement on the spot once they had paid to fix what deferring had cost them, because nothing convinces a man of the value of prevention quite like the bill for not having it. One of those farms belonged to a man named Skinner, out past the county line, who had run his equipment on nothing but hope and hard work for 11 years and lost a full week of planting to a hydraulic failure that Clara found, once she got the pump apart, had been announcing itself for at least 2 seasons in the slow weep of fluid he had mistaken for nothing worth mentioning. She fixed it in a day and a half, charged him the honest rate for the parts and the hours, and did not say a word about what could have been prevented. She did not need to. He signed an agreement for all 4 of his machines before she had finished loading her truck and told her without her asking that he had simply never had anyone show him what the inside of a well-kept machine actually looked like. By the middle of the decade that followed, The barn had 91 standing agreements covering nearly 250 machines, 3 mechanics on staff counting Clara herself, 2 service trucks, and a parts inventory. She still managed the same way she managed everything. Buy right stock what turns over and never keep what is not. None of it had come from a plan drawn up in advance. It had come from a spiral notebook that grew heavier every year, filled with what had failed and when and why, what the early warning had looked like before the failure arrived, and what the fix had cost when it was caught in time against what it cost when it was not. No dealership kept a record like that, because no dealership stayed close enough to the same machines, on the same ground, through enough seasons to know what the record would even need to contain. Farmers who had once driven to Millhaven out of habit started driving past it, adding 20 extra minutes to reach a barn that told them the truth about what was wrong before it told them what it would cost to fix it. Somewhere in those years, without ever setting out to become it, Clara had turned into something she had not planned for back at that kitchen table with Earl's mug in the cabinet. She had become the place in that part of the county where the knowledge lived. Not the knowledge printed in a service manual, but the kind built from watching one population of machines fail and get fixed and fail again, year after year, in this specific ground under this specific weather. Farmers drove past the dealership to reach her barn. They waited on her schedule instead of taking an open slot somewhere else, because her diagnosis had been right the last time, and the time before that, and the time before that, and trust built that way does not need to be advertised. Wade Pruitt called her on a Thursday in the spring of that year. He was selling the dealership. His son had no interest in taking it over, and he had decided he would rather close it clean than hand it to someone who would run it away he did not recognize. He wanted to know, before he put the parts inventory up for county auction, whether Clara wanted first look. She drove to Millhaven the next morning and spent 3 hours going through his shelves, pulling what she could use, pricing it against what she already paid her own supplier, and making him offers she had already worked out in her head before she opened her mouth. She spent $4,200 on parts that would have cost her closer to $6,000 through Danbury, parts she would have needed to order eventually anyway. Before she left, Wade walked her once more through the shop, the service bays, the alignment rack, the lift he had bought the year before he stopped believing the place could turn a profit again. He stopped at the door and looked at her for a moment, the way a man looks at something he is only now willing to admit he misjudged. He said he remembered dropping that tractor at her place all those years back. Said he had thought at the time he was doing her a favor by getting rid of a headache. Clara told him she knew that. He asked what she had ended up doing with it. She told him. The repairs, the demonstration walkthroughs, the agreements it had helped her build one signature at a time, the notebook that had grown from a single spiral pad into a shelf of them, the 2 mechanics who now knew the county's machines nearly as well as she did. He was quiet a moment, turning something over behind his eyes that she did not try to name for him. Then he asked how the business was doing now. She told him it was doing fine. She did not offer the number, and he did not ask for it directly, only looked at her the way a man looks when he is doing arithmetic he already half suspects he will not like the answer to. He smiled, the first time she could remember seeing it in 20 years of knowing him, and said he had dropped a worthless machine at her place, and she had built something worth $500,000 around it. She told him he had dropped a machine he had decided was worthless. She had made a different decision. He said she had been right. She told him the machine had been right. She had only paid attention to what it was telling her. She loaded the parts into her truck and drove home under a sky the color of the one that had hung over her lot the morning the flatbed came, all those years before. The county road ran the same as it always had, past fields she had watched turn over a dozen different ways in a dozen different seasons, past the turnoff to the school, where she had once taught the theory of machines without knowing yet what the metal itself would eventually teach her. The Massey Ferguson was in its usual place along the back fence when she pulled in, engine cold, paint faded at the edges where 30 summers of sun had finally started to win, meter reading past 14,000 hours and still climbing. She cut the truck's engine and sat for a moment in the quiet of the yard, listening to nothing in particular, the settle of gravel under the tires, a dog barking somewhere past the tree line, the low hum of the barn light left on for no reason but habit. Bonnie's truck was already gone for the evening. Otto's tools sat put away on the bench, exactly where he always left them. The notebook was where it had been that morning, open to a page half filled with the week's work, waiting for her to add what the day had cost and what it had brought back. She got out, walked past the tractor without stopping, and laid one hand flat against the hood the way she had every evening for longer than she could easily count anymore. Not out of sentiment, she would have said if anyone had asked, but out of habit, the same habit that checked the mailbox and locked the barn and turned off the drop light before she finally went in. For the night, the engine was cold under her palm, the way it always was this time of day. It would start in the morning the way it had started every morning since the Tuesday she first turned the key, patient, unhurried, exactly as reliable as she had decided, all those years ago, that it deserved the chance to be. Have you ever kept something everyone else had already written off? What happened when you refused to let it go? And when Clara laid her hand on that cold hood, out of nothing but habit, what do you think she was really thanking it for? Thank you for spending this time with us. We read every comment. Until next time,